air sacs or bellows. You can imagine here a network of air sacs kind of connected into this tracheal network, and then all I have to do is squeeze on these air sacs, and that forces air out of the tracheal system, and as these air sacs relax, increasing the volume, that should pull air into these tracheal systems. So we're using this idea of a big air sac. Sometimes these are also called bellows. It's not called that in the figure here, but I've seen them referred to as bellows. Bellows like on a fireplace, right? You have a I pull on the handles like this, air gets sucked into the bellows. I push the handles together and air gets forced out through the bellows, right? So this kind of motion. These air sacs are performing that function. They're helping the air move faster through the tracheal system so that we can get rid of the stuff that's in there and bring in some new stuff much faster than diffusion will allow. Okay? All right, so that's fish. We got some insects. Let's take a look now at amphibians, right? Our first tetrapod, and how amphibians are going to design this respiratory surface. All right, so here's a bullfrog. Bullfrogs can also do cutaneous respiration, but they do also have lungs, so they can do a pulmonary cycle as well. So that buccal cavity is back, that's the mouth cavity. The glottis, that would be the opening over the tube that leads to the lungs. And then we have the ability to increase the size of the buccal cavity. To do that, all I have to do is use these muscles to drop this lower part of the buccal cavity to increase volume in it. So what the frog is going to do, here, there's the buccal cavity. That opening to the buccal cavity again is the mouth, and then here is the glottis. That's the opening into the lung. Okay. All right. So I keep the glottis closed. I open up the buccal cavity. I increase its volume. Air can't come from here, but I can get air to come from outside. Air gets pulled into the buccal cavity. Then I close off the mouth and I pressurize the buccal cavity and I squeeze the air into the lungs. Okay? Then once I've got the air into the lungs, the air is moving across respiratory surface. I should get diffusion of gases right back and forth across the respiratory surface, and then to get the air out, I just squeeze on the lungs and force the air all the way out, and then I repeat the cycle again. One, drop the wall of the buccal cavity, lower the pressure, air comes in. Then I'm going to push air into the lungs and then push air out. Make sense? Okay? Now, because because of the way this system is designed, I can move air in two directions. So as I increase this buccal cavity here, I'm pulling air in, but if I don't close the glottis, then air could also move out at the same time. So I move the wall of the buccal cavity. That pulls air in from here and pulls air in from there. Squeeze on this, force the air in here, and now I've got a system for replacing this deoxygenated air that's full of CO2 now with fresh air with more oxygen. Okay? Now, because the system here involves pressurizing the buccal cavity, right? I'm going to put pressure on it to force air in. We refer to this type of breathing as positive pressure breathing. Oops. Positive pressure breathing. Amphibians do this positive pressure breathing. What you're doing is putting air under pressure in the buccal cavity to squeeze the air into the lungs. Pressurize the buccal cavity, force air into the lower pressure space of the lungs. Is that okay? All right. Now, the amphibians developed this trick of positive pressure breathing. The reptiles, the mammals, and the birds are going to switch over to a different system that we're going to call negative pressure breathing. That is, instead of pushing air into the lungs by increasing the pressure in the buccal cavity, we're going to pull air into the lungs by decreasing the pressure in the lungs. Right? So instead of making air move because of increased pressure in the buccal cavity, positive, I'm making air move into the lungs by decreasing pressure in the lungs. That's the negative pressure breathing. Okay? All right? So that's my diagram here of a reptile. You can see this idea of a large cavity here devoted to a lung. We're going to do the same thing in a human. Okay? All right, so this space here in the thoracic cavity, we've got lungs here, and then we have a tube that brings air into the lungs. At the lower part here on my diagram of the thoracic cavity is this large muscle called the diaphragm. Okay? All right, so basically what I'm going to do with negative pressure breathing is to somehow decrease the pressure within the thoracic cavity, have a tube connecting the lungs to the outside world, and by lowering the pressure in the lungs relative to the outside world, air will get sucked in through negative pressure breathing. Okay? All right, so, just changing my notes. All right, so, here what I'm going to do is increase the size of the thoracic cavity. For the most part, what we're talking about are these muscles associated with the ribs called the external intercostals. Right? These muscles, when they contract, they take the rib cage and they lift it up. Okay, so I contract those, it pulls the thoracic cavity open this way, and at the same time, I'm going to contract this diaphragm muscle. When it contracts, it straightens out or tries to straighten out. So the contraction straightens out this diaphragm, further opening up the volume within the thoracic cavity. Okay. All right. Now, this process of contracting the external intercostals and contracting the diaphragm, collectively what we're getting is this process of inhalation, right? I'm inhaling air because of the activity of these two sets of muscles. Okay, now between you and me, when you're at rest, these muscles are doing the main work of inhalation. Right? These muscles are designed to do this inhalation process over and over and over again. Think about muscles that aren't fatiguing as much because they're designed to do this contraction over and over and over again your entire life. Okay? There are other muscles that can be involved under heavier exercise, and you want to increase the size of the thoracic cavity even more. There are other muscles involved. Sternocleidomastoid and these scalene muscles are two big groups as well as 13 plus other muscle groups that are also involved in inhalation under heavier load, right? Heavier metabolic activity. All right. But for our purposes, these are the two main groups of muscles that are doing this process of inhalation. Okay? Exhalation is a process of relaxing these muscles. If I relax the external intercostals, I relax the diaphragm, I get what's called exhalation. Right? The relaxation of the diaphragm allows it to come up, decreasing the size of the thoracic cavity. As I relax the external intercostals, the rib cage comes down, decreasing the size of the thoracic cavity. Inhaling air, exhaling air. Okay? All right, now, this design that allows for decreasing and increasing the volume of the thoracic cavity is referred to as negative pressure breathing. It's very different from what amphibians do, where they squeeze air into their lungs. Here we're pulling air into our lungs because of the decreased volume in the lungs. Sorry, increased volume in the lungs. As you increase the volume in the lungs, you drop the pressure, that pulls the air in. Okay? Now, kind of the choice to do this type of breathing leads to some other issues. And that is, as you put the lungs under this increased volume, air is going to be pulled in. You also put some pressure on parts of the lung and the tubes that connect the lungs to the outside world. So here, the main tube we're going to talk about here is the trachea. Right? And then the trachea branches into two separate bronchi. There's a bronchus there, and there's also a bronchus here. There's the trachea there. The bronchus branches and branches and branches until the branches kind of get small enough that we refer to these as bronchioles. So on my diagram here, there's a bronchus, there's a bronchiole. And then if we followed these bronchiole all the way down to the end, or the terminus, let's do that here, I would reach this, which is referred to as a terminal bronchiole. The terminal bronchiole then has a bunch of these sacs associated with it, kind of grape-like clusters, where each one of these that makes up this cluster is called an alveolus. The group together, we would say they are alveoli, but an individual one would be an alveolus. Okay? Now, like I said, when you increase the volume of the thoracic cavity, you're decreasing the pressure. Okay? Decreasing the pressure. So if I decrease the pressure inside an alveolus, I decrease the pressure inside the bronchiole, I decrease the pressure inside the bronchus, I decrease the pressure inside the trachea, because the low pressure in all of these is what moves air from the outside down into the system. Right? If somehow increasing the volume of the thoracic cavity didn't change the pressure in the trachea, the bronchus, the bronchiole, etc., then air wouldn't move in. So these are all now under lower pressure. And the danger with them being under lower pressure is that they could collapse. So imagine I've got this tube, and what I'm going to do is decrease the pressure in this cavity. The tendency would be for the tube to go and just collapse, because now the pressure inside here is lower than the pressure outside. tube collapses. So, for the bronchioles and the trachea, what we're going to do is reinforce these with rings of cartilage. So here I'm going to put these cartilage rings all the way around. I'm trying to draw this so it looks like a ring, right? And I can continue to do that down through here. You can see some of that up here, that little pieces of cartilage, right? The idea is I'm reinforcing these straws or tubes so that as pressure drops inside of them, they don't collapse on themselves like a straw would. Instead, they maintain their shape, and by maintaining their shape, the volume is kept there, which allows the pressure to change, which allows air to come in. Okay? All right, now the alveoli, they don't have that option. You can't put cartilage around them. And the reason is because the alveoli are where gas exchange is going to occur. So I'm going to build my circulatory system around all these alveoli, and all of this stuff here should be capillary bed. Okay? Now, you should think to yourself, well, why couldn't I just reinforce these alveoli in much the same way that I reinforce the trachea or the bronchus, right? Why can't I do that? Well, the reason is because in order for this alveolar membrane to function properly as a respiratory membrane, gases have to be able to diffuse back and forth. And we said before, what makes a respiratory surface a good respiratory surface is it's thin, it's moist, and not a lot of structural tissue. These cartilage rings, they're structural tissue. I can't put that structural tissue around the alveoli because it would impair gas exchange. So I need to come up with another solution that will prevent the alveoli from collapsing on themselves as the volume of the thoracic cavity increases. Okay? All right, so to understand this, we have the idea that there are a couple of different types of alveoli. Okay? A couple of different types.